Okay, ladies and gentlemen, hello everyone. Bear with me a moment. Now, there are a few reasons that I'm coming to you live today, which I will explain momentarily. But firstly, I might just take a link to this live stream and stick it on Twitter to let people know that I am coming at you. Let me see. Let me see. Welcome everybody. I'm just tweeting. Behind the scenes action there. Hello everyone. Thank you for being here. This is quite tragic, really, isn't it? We're back here again. You may remember this time last year, on my 21st birthday, my country, the United Kingdom, had forced us into a national lockdown, and so I spent it on my own in a house with nothing to do. So I decided to come live. Now, funnily enough, we are in the exact same situation a year later. It's my birthday yet again, and we are in national lockdown yet again, and I'm stuck inside yet again. So I thought, what better way to spend it than by going live just like I did last year? And there are a few reasons I wanted to do it. One of the reasons was that I accidentally went live about a week or two ago. I can't remember. I was supposed to be doing my private Patreon live stream, which I do on a kind of every so often type basis, at least until my exams are over in the summer. And I had to reset up the live stream, and I accidentally just went live to the entire world. And so I had to profusely apologize to the few hundred people that showed up in the first minute or two, and just say, listen, I'm sorry, I will do a live stream at some point for everybody in the near future. And that's what you can say this is. Another reason is that I wanted to thank you, by the way. I'm just looking at the live chat. There's lots of wonderful birthday messages coming in, and I really appreciate that. One of the other reasons that I wanted to come on stream real quick is because I had a little bit of time here on this birthday of mine, and I wanted to explain essentially that we're kind of where I'm at the moment, which is I have my final exams for university this summer. They start sometime right at the end of May, and they finish mid-June, I think June 17th. So essentially, from this time on, because they start in just over a month, about a month time. Is it a month? No, is it 2 months time? I don't know. I should be more on top of these things. Whatever, they start soon. And so about now is the time that I really need to knuckle down and start actually focusing, right? So what it essentially means is that for the foreseeable future until mid-June, I'm going to be posting very sparsely, if at all. If you don't see very much content from me, that's why. I know I always say that I'm at university, I'm busy, I've got exams, but these are my actual final exams, the only ones that actually count towards my degree. For the entire 3 years that I've been at university, the only thing that matters is the exam or the set of exams at the end of the 3 years. And that's what I have in the summer. So I've got to prepare for that. So until then, you're probably not going to see very much of me. So I wanted to come on a live stream just to say hello, to let you know that's going to happen, and essentially spend some time doing this in what might be the last time I'll get to do it for at least a few months. So what I usually do on live streams like this, and what I did last year, was I basically did a Q&A. I should really have set the live chat to slow mode. I'm not sure I can actually do that now because I feel like it might just go a bit crazy. But if you do have any questions, philosophical questions, interesting questions, that you think might be of interest, then pop them in the live chat, and I'll see what I can do. But yeah, isn't it just a strange and tragic situation that we're in, that I entered lockdown age 20 and I will exit it aged at least 22. That is insane. Now, last year, because it was my 21st birthday, but it was going to suck because it was going to be in lockdown, I decided this time last year to celebrate my 22nd birthday instead, and celebrate my 21st birthday when I turned 22. I've now turned 22, and I'm still not going to celebrate my 21st birthday because it still sucks. So I'm going to postpone that yet again till next year. So because we did the 22nd last year, and the 21st is going to be next year, I guess I'm technically now celebrating my 23rd birthday. Yeah, it's a sorry situation that we're in. Somebody is at the door. I suppose I'll have to ignore that. Actually, let me go and see who that is. It might be important. Apologies, everybody. I'm back. It was the postman. Okay, don't worry. I'm back. Okay, this is going to be quite difficult because the live chat's just kind of popping off a little bit, but I'm just going to kind of pick things at random. So sorry if I don't see your message. Somebody has asked, um, are veganism and abortion compatible? Wow, what a hell of a way to set this off. A lot of people like to ask this actually when you talk about veganism and the vegan project. One of the things that people like to bring up is abortion, as if the issues are connected. And I can understand why they do so. And oftentimes it's kind of done as a criticism. A lot of people will say they'll essentially construct an ad hominem argument against the vegan by saying, look, you're the same kind of person who's totally cool with just killing babies in the womb. Like you think it's wrong to to destroy eggs or to, kill chicks, but you think it's fine to kill babies or something like this, which isn't really what's going on here, obviously. I think that one of the most important things to take note of um, is the difference in terms of the justification being given, right? So I understand that the issue seems similar in the sense that we've got a being who, presumably, at least in the interesting moral cases, is capable of suffering, and discussing our right to inflict suffering upon that being. The difference is that the strength of the vegan argument, especially against things like factory farming, is the kind of is just how trivial the thing that we're killing these animals for is. So we're talking about killing animals, harming animals for the sake of transient sensory pleasure, which is nothing. In abortion cases, at least the ethically difficult cases for abortion, people like to talk about things like bodily autonomy, not invasive medical procedures. It gets it's a lot more. I should say, it's a lot less trivial. In other words, the philosophy should probably be the same, which is one of kind of characterizing people's rights correctly and determining what we have an ethical right to do to other creatures and what kinds of things can warrant that kind of treatment. For instance, even the pro-life crowd will agree that abortions, at least most of them will agree that abortions are permissible in instances where the pregnancy causes a risk to the life of the mother. And why is that? What it shows is that although there is something of a kind of rule against having abortions, there's always some discussion to be had about when there are situations that warrant terminating a pregnancy, right? And the question is kind of which warrants are sufficient. Is it a sufficient warrant just to say that I don't want to give birth? Is it a sufficient warrant if you don't think that that's a sufficient warrant? What about like some economic concerns that people like to throw out? What about like what if it's an even more difficult case? What if somebody was pregnant as a result of sexual assault? These kind of things, and it's kind of a gradation scale. People tend to think that even if they don't think one is permissible, even if they don't think it's permissible in any circumstance to have an abortion, they might see that it's kind of more permissible or less obviously permissible or something like this. In other words, I'm kind of rambling here, but what I'm trying to say is that these are not actually the same situations, right? In the vegan case, a lot of the time, the strength of the argument comes from talking about inflicting unambiguously torture upon an animal for the sake of sensory pleasure, which can be gotten elsewhere, right? You can get that taste pleasure somewhere else. You can get the nutrition that you need somewhere else. That's why the vegan argument is so strong, because the justification being provided for harming these animals is so minuscule. Whereas in the case of abortion, it's never people don't like a lot of the time, at least in the kind of difficult, interesting philosophical debates you see, people aren't arguing about like getting pregnant for the sake of killing the baby because you want to kill that baby and eat its flesh or something like this. I think that even a pro-choicer would say that they have at least some ethical qualm with somebody who was purposefully getting pregnant in order to kill that baby, in order to eat that baby or do something with that baby, right? Like, I think we'd say, even if we don't think that the baby is a human life or something like this, or you don't think it's capable of suffering, there's some kind of virtue ethics intuition that tells us that there's something at least morally questionable about that. But that's kind of what's going on with veganism, right? That's what's going on, is somebody is inflicting unambiguous harm upon an animal for something that is quite obviously trivial. In the case of abortion, I just don't think that's the case. I think that it's a much more difficult conversation to have. So I realize I'm not telling you kind of what I think about abortion here, but that's not what the question was. The question is about this link between veganism and abortion, and I can see why people draw it, but I don't think it's entirely appropriate. Partly because of the fact that if we think in this way, then basically anything can be compared in this manner. Because you say, well, veganism is like abortion, because in both cases you're like harming somebody or something like this. You know, you're inflicting harm upon someone who's innocent. That can be true in loads and loads of different ethical scenarios. You know, it can be true in like euthanasia or something. In the case of euthanasia, we're talking about whether or not we have sufficient warrant to end someone's life. And someone could be like, well, how can you be okay with this position on euthanasia, but you've got this position on veganism? It's like, I don't think they're as comparable as people think they are. I think that to make them comparable, you have to go as broad as saying something like, well, they both involve taking innocent life or something like this, which is so broad as to encompass way too much to be worth considering together, if that makes sense. Um, okay, let me have a look here. Alex, is killing a bee or an ant equal to killing a cow for food? What do you think if the factory farms start killing animals in a way without causing suffering? I mean, a very quick way. Do you think that's okay? Bear in mind that veganism is about veganism is about minimizing suffering, right? It's about if we can avoid inflicting suffering upon animals, then we should do so. The question often comes up: what about an animal that can't suffer? And the kind of what vegans like to say is they like to say, well, actually, they are suffering. You just don't realize that they're suffering. Someone will say, what if I just like had a chicken in my backyard and I killed it for meat? Is that okay because they're not suffering? And the vegan oftentimes likes to kind of press why actually that is causing suffering. But you know, as a thinking with our philosophy caps on, we have to kind of think about the principle that we're using to justify veganism. And so, if it is literally true that the animal does not suffer, then I can't see a problem, right? If there's no suffering, I don't think there's any problem. But we have to consider not just the suffering of the animal that we kill in a particular act of eating an animal product, but also the suffering that we can inflict kind of as a result of this. So, for instance, if it's a social creature and if you take a cow's calf and kill the calf, you've got to worry about the suffering of the mother as well as the calf itself. You also have to worry about the kind of social implications of a worldview which permits the exploitation of animals. Is that actually going to lead to more suffering? These are things that need to be considered. But in an isolated scenario, I don't think if there's no suffering, I don't think it's a problem. At least for the being that's being killed. The problem is that I think we have to be consistent between animals and human beings. So people like to say, what if we had an animal who didn't feel any pain? We just killed them instantly and ate their flesh. As long as you'd be okay doing this also to a human in the same situation with the same characteristics, then you're fine. You're being consistent. But most people would say that they still think that's wrong. Most people would say no, like even if it's going to be an instant death, yada yada yada, I still shouldn't be able to kill another human being just based on the fact that they're not going to feel that pain. Then you just run the name the trait argument again. You just say, well, look, I mean, what is it that's different about this human and this pig that makes it okay to kill the pig painlessly, but not okay to kill the human being painlessly? And I don't think you'll be able to find a very good moral difference there. But you may say something like, well, I think that it's because the pigs don't have sociability. And if we found a human being who genuinely wasn't sociable, had no social connections, no family, no friends, and you killed them painlessly, I don't think that would be wrong. You can take that view if you like. I at least would say that it's not bad for the person who dies. I don't think it's bad to die, because if you die painlessly and you're unaware of your death forthcoming, then that death can't be bad for you because you literally don't exist anymore, and something can't be bad for someone who doesn't exist. So I could at least say that consistently, and I would say that it's certainly not bad for the animal that you kill painlessly if you kill them to eat their flesh or something. But I still think my ethical intuitions scream at me that there's still something wrong with taking an innocent human being's life, even if you kill them painlessly. And I have to be consistent and apply that to animals too. But I think that it's a much more kind of nuanced or niche case. I mean, the strength of the vegan argument is against factory farming and the most obvious forms of animal cruelty. It's like nobody even tries to argue against factory farming. It can't be done. So whilst these other cases are kind of interesting to discuss, like I'm not as kind of, I almost don't care as much. Like if the entire animal agricultural industry was one where animals were being killed completely painlessly without any awareness or something, there may still be like philosophical, ethical qualms with this, but I certainly wouldn't make it like the focus of my career, right? It wouldn't be the thing that I was talking about all the time, because although like philosophically, if you press me on the question, I'd probably say that it may well still be wrong. it's not so much wrong. It's not so wrong that I'd want to dedicate my life to it in the same way. I noticed live chat, super chats. I forgot super chats were a thing. That's actually a very good way to offset the fact that I forgot to turn slow mode on. So Apostate Prophet, good to see you. Thanks for the donation, and it'd be good to catch up soon. I just need to close this door. Somebody's being noisy outside. By the way, if you haven't seen it yet, everybody, this is like my new, probably fairly temporary office/video recording setup. You'll have seen it in maybe like 1 or 2 videos so far, but I hope you like it. Let me know what you think. If you think anything should be changed, if there are any aesthetic improvements that you can think of, do be sure to let me know. Patrick, thank you also for the live chat. Vegan Camp Out. Yes, fantastic. That should go as a reminder for everyone, by the way. I'm speaking at Vegan Camp Out this August, and tickets are available at vegancampout.co.uk. If you just Google Vegan Camp Out, it should come up. There are some really great speakers. We've got Russell Brand, I think is like the headliner guy, but people like Joey Carbstrong, Patrick Baboumian from the Game Changers documentary, which you may have seen, as well as a bunch of other people. The lineup's online. The lineup is online. See if you can come, because I think it would be quite a good event. So I'm quite flustered here, really, because I always forget when I go live that I should really like get someone helping me, because trying to keep track of the live chat, trying to make sure everything's still actually running, whilst also trying to answer questions is quite difficult. So if I seem a bit flustered, that's why. We've got another question from Vlastimil, another super chat, so thank you. Is there a level of suffering that is morally justifiable in order to achieve a taste sensation? If taste has value, does it mean that letting an animal suffer a little for taste can be justified? This is an interesting question. Clearly, like, taste does have value, right? Vegans like to hyperbolize a little bit by saying that taste doesn't have any moral worth. It does. It does. It brings some sense of pleasure, right? It's so trivial that it's negligible. But there is something there, right? Like, taste pleasure is worth something. And the question is, if we can have like a really, really minimal amount of animal suffering, can we inflict that to justify our sense pleasure? I would say probably still not, right? Because even if, let's say that we quantify this and we say that the taste pleasure is worth +2 points of pleasure, and we can inflict suffering on an animal that equates to, -2 points of pleasure. So 2 points of suffering, and these are kind of equal. Does that justify us in inflicting that suffering in order to get that minuscule pleasure? I still think not. The reason why we emphasize that taste pleasure is such a trivial thing is just to kind of overemphasize, it's just to overdetermine the fact that we shouldn't be using this to justify harming animals. But even if they were the same, there's still this question, like, do you have a right to inflict suffering upon somebody if it will bring you pleasure, so long as, the kind of suffering that they receive balances out with the pleasure that you receive? I don't think so. I don't think I could go up to another human being and commit some harm against them unconsensually, so long as I will be benefited in some way that equals it out. I don't think that's how it works. I don't think you have the right to inflict suffering upon someone for your own benefit, even if the suffering is minuscule and even if your own benefit is quite large. David Benatar discusses this quite interestingly and compellingly in Better Never to Have Been, but he applies this to the person themselves, right? He says, we don't even think it's ethically justifiable to harm somebody else without their consent to bring them some form of benefit in most cases. For instance, if I could break somebody's arm, which would be quite painful, and they'd be in a sling for however long you're in a sling for, but eventually, they get their arm function back and everything's fine. And by doing so, they get an encyclopedic knowledge of the history of philosophy. And they're a philosophy student, so that will be genuinely worthwhile to them. Given the choice, they may even may even say that that's what they want. If they were given the option to have their arm broken to gain this knowledge, they might say that's what they want. But if you don't have that consent, you don't have the right to just go and inflict that suffering. Even if you're confident that they will be benefited more by the knowledge of philosophy, you don't have the right to go and inflict that suffering on them, to go and break their arm to bring it about. It needs to be consensual. And I think that has an intuitive truth to it. Obviously, there are some problem cases, such as administering painful medical procedures to somebody who's not in a position to consent or something like this. But that's something he discusses. But in the general course of things, we wouldn't even justify inflicting harm unconsensually upon a person to then benefit them. right, without their consent. And yet, the kind of question we're asking here is whether we can inflict harm upon another, that is, like another being, another animal, for our own pleasure, not for their pleasure, for our own pleasure. I think even if these balance out, there's no justification to be doing this. So when we say, and it's so much suffering for an animal and only a tiny bit of pleasure for you, that's just over determining the case. Even if it was quite a lot of pleasure, even if it was a significant amount of pleasure, you don't have the right to go and inflict torturous suffering on another being as long as you balance it out with your own pleasure. That's not really how ethics works, as far as I'm concerned. Thank you, vegan atheist. And I'm sorry, I've just realized that these are probably disappearing as well. These super chats, because they're like timed, I think, based on the donation or something. If yours has disappeared or I haven't answered it, then send me an email, I suppose, and just let me know, because I feel quite bad that they're just disappearing because I'm rambling on too much. James, the name the trait argument. Oh, okay. So James is talking about running the name the trait argument on human fetuses. It can't be consciousness, because then it would be legal to kill a baby that was born into a coma that was likely to be conscious in the future. Yeah, so this is actually the name the trait argument, although it's not called that, is employed quite a lot by the pro-life crowd to essentially argue their case. They say, well, look, I mean, what are you using to justify killing this baby? And if true of a baby who's already born, would you use that to justify killing them as well? So if somebody says, well, I'm allowed to kill this baby because it's dependent on the mother, it's a parasite, the pro-life person will say, well, that's true of some babies who are born, right? In fact, most babies who are born are still dependent on at least somebody. And, would we justify killing a baby who's already been born for the sake of, due to the fact that they're still dependent on somebody else? And we think probably not. So that can't be the thing that justifies it in the womb either. You definitely, like, the argument can be run in the same way. Yes. That, like, I when I say that they're not comparable, I mean, like, they are literally, you can run the same kind of ethical thinking. The name the trait argument is a really good way to ethicize in general, I think. On the issue of abortion, it's difficult to know. I think there's a lot of people kind of talking past each other and saying things that don't really make sense. There are a lot of kind of bad pro-choice arguments, a lot of really bad pro-life arguments. I think that the idea that personhood begins at conception is as silly as the idea that it doesn't begin until, like, the moment it pops outside the womb. I really don't know what I think about abortion, and I need to. I know what my intuitions tell me, but I haven't kind of confidently enough. I haven't confidently enough kind of come to a conclusion that I could argue publicly. I'm always happy to have the discussion and have a back and forth and talk to somebody who has really does have a strong opinion. The problem is that even having that conversation can be quite controversial, because if you ask the wrong question, it can come across quite badly. So I need to more strongly solidify what I think about abortion before I kind of actually make any statements on it. But yes, the name the trait argument would be a good way of going about it, and I'm sure I will address it properly in the future. I've been meaning to maybe, like, make a video on it or something, because I've spoken about abortion and various specific abortion cases in all kinds of live streams and Q&As and things, but I've never kind of put it on a video. But one of the reasons for that is because I don't have, like, a general position that I can just put straight forward. But at some point, I'm sure I will. I just don't want to. There's so much that I've said on other topics, even like in the philosophy of religion, that a few years later I've realized that I was just utterly wrong about. And I don't want to do that on something as important and as kind of socially important as abortion, unless I'm confident that I'm not going to hear some knockdown argument that's going to change my mind in, like, a year's time. So that's why I haven't really addressed it directly, I'm afraid. Another super chat. You've convinced me that going vegan is the morally correct thing to do. Well, thank you. That does genuinely mean a lot. How hard was it for you to transition from meat eater to vegan? Advice? It was incredibly easy for me, and I think it was due to a particular mindset. And the mindset was this: I didn't think, like, here's where I kind of stop eating animal products. For the rest of my life, I'm never going to eat an animal product anymore. That seems like quite a big commitment, which it would be, and it kind of is, right? Like, obviously, relative to the suffering that you're preventing, it's nothing. But relative to just your day-to-day activities, it seems like quite a big jump. But don't think of it in that terms. Think of it on a meal by meal basis. So don't think I'm going to be vegan for the rest of my life. Just think I'm going to be vegan for breakfast. That's how I did it. I woke up one day, I went into town and I thought, you know what? I'm going to try a vegan breakfast just to see what it tastes like. And it was fine. Obviously, it's just a normal breakfast with some of the ingredients changed, right? I had some like vegan pancakes or something. And then I was like, okay, now I'm interested. I want to see what it's like to have a vegan lunch. So I went and had a vegan lunch. And I haven't had an animal product ever since. And it's always been on this kind of meal by meal basis. If you're going to go and cook a beef curry, just swap the beef for chickpeas and just eat that instead. And you think, well, it hasn't changed the meal that much. Like that's fine. As long as you do that every single meal, you're vegan. You don't need to, it's all about kind of the way you think about it, in my view. Don't think of it as like this big thing that you're adopting that's going to change your life forever. Think of it on a meal by meal basis, and I think it will be a lot easier for you. Okay. There's a super chat here. Happy birthday. Thank you. Always wondered what your thoughts were on the implications of determinism on moral systems, legal accountability for actions. It's certainly a very interesting question, but it's one that I have answered elsewhere. Firstly, in a talk called The Good Delusion, which is on my YouTube channel. That's where I discuss essentially the implications of determinism for like moral philosophy in general. But on kind of like the legal system and accountability and this kind of stuff, I had a conversation years ago now with Steve Woodford, Rationality Rules, and I think it's on his channel, that particular discussion. If you type in Rationality Rules, Cosmic Skeptic, Free Will, find the discussion that Steve and I had in my back garden a few years ago. It's on exactly that topic, and we go quite in depth. So I think you'll find your answers there. Just because I don't want to go around repeating myself. Do you have an account? Says Isakul. I'm not even going to bother trying to pronounce it properly. Do you have an account on the nature of harm and or the harm of death? Can we reconcile veganism if Epicureans are right about death not being bad? Also, do you have a Discord? I don't have a Discord. Actually, I think I may have it. I think someone may have set up a Discord. But I don't know how Discord works. I've never understood it. I don't know if it's like something that I need to like share a link to or something. People keep telling me I need to understand how Discord works, and I'm sure I'll get around to it, as with everything at the moment, after my finals. To your question about death, as many of you will know, I've been promising a video about death and whether death is bad for quite a long time now. And the reason I've put it off is, can you guess? Ding, ding, ding. Finals, obviously, of course. It's just all everything that I want to do at the moment is just being postponed by the fact, or due to the fact that I have final exams. But I still plan to make that video afterwards. In brief, I think that I kind of agree with the Epicureans in the sense that death isn't bad intrinsically for the person who dies. Right? It's not being dead, I should say, is not bad for the dead person. Right? The process of dying can be bad. Obviously, it can be painful or whatever. But the actual state of being dead isn't bad for the person who dies. So really with ethics, I think that what we need to talk about is the infliction of suffering rather than just the infliction of death. People think that there's an intrinsic value to life, which is a question I should perhaps kind of explore in that video, because on a kind of pleasure and suffering based worldview, there's no intrinsic value to life in the way that there would be on like a Christian worldview or something. It is just about the suffering that's inflicted. What you can say is that ethics isn't just about kind of the perspective of the victim. It's also about the perspective of the perpetrator. So can it be like wrong to do an act that doesn't actually cause any suffering? I think some people would intuitively say that the answer is yes. For example, you know, if somebody were to like look at some child porn, but it wasn't actually child porn, it was just like an image of a child that they used for sexual gratification, right? Many people would say that this is wrong, even though technically, I mean, it's not causing any suffering, right? The photo wasn't produced with the intent of it being used in that way. You know, no one's ever going to find out that this person has done this. Obviously, there's a complication in that if people do find out this is happening, that could cause suffering. But presuming no one would find out, that's not going to cause any suffering. But some people would like to say that there's still something wrong about doing this, implying that wrongness and rightness isn't just about kind of what happens to the person who receives a particular action, but it's about the person who actually commits it as well. You might be like a virtue ethicist who thinks that there are kind of right and wrong ways of behaving, regardless of the consequences. In the case of death, we could apply this kind of thought to say, even if killing somebody painlessly or something isn't bad for the person who dies, that doesn't mean it's not wrong to do it. It can still be wrong to commit a particular action, even though it's not bad for the person who the action is being committed against. But you asked specifically about reconciling this with veganism. And I understand why, because if death isn't bad for the person who dies, then death isn't bad for animals. And so, is it really wrong to kill animals? I'm at least sympathetic to the idea that there could be a very consistent moral philosophy that says that it's okay to painlessly kill animals. However, it would all depend on like how it's done, right? And it would have to be consistent with our worldview towards human beings. I think it was Jeff McMahon who wrote a paper called, was it called something like benevolent carnivorism or something like this? And it was essentially discussing this exact question, like presuming that death isn't really bad for the person who dies, is there a system of kind of killing animals that we could say is morally justifiable? He argues that there is, but it's a very specific one, because in a human context, we wouldn't justify, for instance, bringing new human beings into existence with the express purpose of killing them when they turn 18 so that we can eat their flesh. And somebody might say, but look, they're killed painlessly. They don't even know that they're going to be killed. And if we didn't kind of give birth to them with the intention of eventually killing them, they wouldn't have been born at all. So if anything, we're doing them a favor. This is exactly what people say about animals in the meat industry. They say, look, they're killed painlessly. They don't know it's coming to them. And they wouldn't have been born in the first place if we weren't going to eat them. But we wouldn't be okay doing this to a human being, right? Because we think that Jeff McMahon says, although it might be actually better that the person exists rather than doesn't exist. In other words, yeah, it's like a good thing that they were brought into existence. Once they're in existence, they have certain rights. They have a right not to be killed, which means that although it's kind of like the situation in which they're born and eventually killed is better for them because they got to exist, their rights are still being violated once they're born if somebody kills them, even if that's the whole reason they were born into existence in the first place. So Jeff McMahon argues that, like, you can't harm someone who doesn't exist yet, but once they're brought into existence, then they have particular rights and they can be harmed. So Jeff McMahon says one thing we could do is try to essentially do some kind of genetic engineering such that animals are born with this natural, so to speak, inclination to die quite young, right? They die of natural causes, or they die kind of their own accord, I should say, after maybe like a year or two or something like this. Because technically, in this case, nobody gets harmed, because when you do the genetic engineering, the animal hasn't been born yet, so there's no one to be harmed. You're not harming anyone. And once the animal's been born, you're not doing anything. You're just kind of letting them live in accordance with their genetics. And he says maybe this might work as long as it's painless, of course. This might be a circumstance in which it would be okay. But then he once again says, look, would we be okay doing this with human beings? Would we be okay genetically engineering somebody or the process of conception such that a baby was born that was naturally going to die when it was 5 so that we could eat its flesh, right? People would probably still say that's wrong. And this is the big problem, right? It's not just a question of like applying our intuitions about death to animals. We have to make sure that we're being consistent. We have to make sure that if we took a human being and gave them the same relevant characteristics as the animal, that we treat them in the same way. Or if we wouldn't, that we can identify exactly why we're treating one differently and what that justification is. But I think, yeah, there are certainly like hypothetical situations I can think of in which it would be perfectly fine to kill an animal. There are loads of examples. The famous desert island example. Most vegans would say you'd be permitted to kill the pig. The question is, are there situations where it's okay to take the life of an animal where you don't actually need to, if it doesn't cause any suffering? And I would say that only if you can consistently hold that view of human beings. So yeah, that's how I'd answer that question. But again, the question of the badness of death I'll go into properly in more detail when I make this video on death, which will come at some point in the summer-ish time after I've finished my exams. Somebody I just saw in the live chat kind of whizzed by. Somebody asked about my thoughts on suicide as well. which I was going to kind of roll into this topic of death, because they seem to kind of go hand in hand. But I think suicide is a very special case, and I think it deserves its own video. And I want to make a video about suicide and the ethics of suicide, which is something that doesn't get a lot of discussion. It's quite difficult to find ethical material around suicide. There are plenty of like books you can read and stuff, but if you're just kind of doing a general search looking for talks or debates or whatever, if you try googling, philosophical questions around suicide, like, should we all kill ourselves, you're going to get a big number pointing you to the Samaritans and to telling you to phone them immediately. Like it can be quite it's quite a difficult area to navigate. But I do have lots and lots of various views on suicide, about the right to suicide. And there are some interesting implications. For example, the religious prohibition against suicide is one that's interestingly tackled by David Hume. The religious argument against suicide, at least at his time, was something like, look, life is sacred. You don't get to determine when your life ends. That's up to God, right? Like by killing yourself, you are kind of negating natural causes and what God intended for you. You're taking it into your own hand. You're taking that sanctity and you're blaspheming against it by killing yourself. David Hume quite ingeniously points out that this would also, or should also, prevent us from trying to extend people's lives with medical care, right? Because if somebody's about to die of natural causes and we give them a form of medicine, or if someone's going to die of cancer and we treat them with chemotherapy, we're doing the same thing. We're saying, look, God, I know that naturally, so to speak, this person was going to die at a different time, but I'd rather them die at another time, right? By like trying to preserve our own lives against natural causes that are trying to bring about our death, like diseases and stuff like this, we're saying to God, like, no, I'm going to decide that I don't die at this point, even though naturally I would have done. As if the religious argument was something like, by killing yourself, you're dying at the wrong time. It's not up to you to decide when to take that life. He makes an argument that the same thing should be said about extending life, right? And that's quite interesting and deserves some discussion. Because even in the case of extending life, you still don't like kill yourself. You don't do an action that causes your death. You just prolong the point at which, or postpone the point at which you eventually die, but again, not at your own hand. So they may still be different there, but it's worth discussing. But a lot of people, liberal thinkers, libertarian thinkers, will say that we have a right to suicide. If you want to kill yourself, you should be able to do so. But there are always kinds of provisions here. It's like people say, well, if somebody's being really frantic and then not in a kind of rational mindset, then maybe we should prevent them. But if they have a right to do it, don't they have a right to do it for any reason? I mean, if somebody wants to buy a car and they're getting ripped off, right? I can advise them that this is a bad idea, but it's their right to do it, right? If they want to buy a car that's worth £5,000 for £150,000, I might be able to tell them that, like, this is a really bad decision, but it's their right to do it. It's their money. They can spend it in that way. If we take the same view of like a right to suicide, then we have to say that not only should somebody be able to kill themselves when their life is bad enough, they should have a right to kill themselves for any reason. Their life could be going very, very well, and they just think, you know what, I'm bored, I've had enough of this, I want to die, and they should have a right to do so. And again, like, the liberal or the libertarian might not be too troubled by this. They might say, yeah, it would upset me if someone kills themselves for a bad reason, but it's their right to do so. But we have to consider the implications of what it means to have a right to do something. If you have as I said in a fairly recent video, rights always have correlative duties, right? If you have a right to something, it means somebody else has a duty not to do something to you, or to do something to you. If you have a right to life, it means somebody else has a duty not to kill you. If I have a right to extract money from you because you signed a contract or something, then that means you have a duty to provide that money. Rights, in other words, or at least these kinds of rights, called claim rights oftentimes in the literature, necessitate, imply the existence of duties. If we apply this to the right to suicide, we're left in a pretty interesting conundrum, because if somebody has a right to suicide, what that means is that other people have a duty not to interfere with their suicide. That's what it means for them to have a right to suicide. It means we have a duty not to interfere. But does this mean that if you're driving along the Golden Gate Bridge and you see somebody about to jump, ask yourself the question, do you think that you should go and try and stop them? Most people would say that you have an obligation to go. Well, I should say a lot of people would say that you have some form of obligation, or at least it would be highly morally virtuous to, try and stop them from jumping off the bridge. But if they have a right to suicide, that means you have a duty not to intervene with them. And what that means is not only do you not have an obligation to save them, you have an obligation not to save them, right? Because if that person's trying to kill themselves and they have a right to suicide, that means you have a duty not to intervene with their suicide, and so you can't intervene. Now, of course, there may be there are like more nuances to extract here. Maybe they have a right to suicide in certain circumstances. We should say that people have an ethical right to suicide, so long as they've ticked all these boxes and are thinking rationally and all of this kind of stuff. But in that situation, like you realize that's a difficult ethical conundrum, right? Because it can be quite easy to just kind of just accept this kind of libertarian position that, yeah, sure, people should be able to kill themselves for any reason. They have a right to kill themselves. But if that's true, that means we have a duty not to intervene. So if you see someone trying to kill yourself, you have a duty to not intervene, to let them do it, to watch them jump off that bridge. And I think our ethical intuitions tell us that we at least are permitted to try and stop them. So that's something that definitely needs investigation and discussion. So there'll be a video about that coming out at some point in the future. Again, I don't know exactly when. Thank you for that other super chat. Why? Would love if you made a video about David Dutch's views. I haven't read them, but thank you for bringing them to my attention. Again, maybe after my finals, I'll be able to do so. Akil, Brian, thank you for the super chat. I took your advice from one of your previous videos, read the first chapter of Animal Liberation, been plant-based for 36 days. Congratulations, and thank you for taking up that mantle. Animal Liberation is the most important book that I've ever read in terms of its actual impact on my life. It's not even that it's like particularly philosophically impressive or anything like that. It's just that he was one of the only people kind of talking about it at the time. So he puts it very plainly in a way that's fairly easy to understand and fairly compelling, but it's not like, overwhelmingly clever moral philosophy. It's just kind of saying, hey, listen, you already believe a lot of this stuff. Let's just apply it to animals and see what happens. The first chapter of Animal Liberation is what I always recommend to anybody who wants an introduction to veganism. It's about 20 pages long, and that first chapter alone is enough to make most people at least take veganism seriously. So if you haven't read it, it's always at the top of my list of book recommendations of people. Another super chat, and I think I'll make this my last one because I will have to dash, and I wasn't planning on having a super in-depth Q&A anyway. I just kind of wanted to check in, say hi, warn you about the fact that I've got exams coming up and probably won't be uploading, and maybe answer a few questions. But hi, Alex. Because of you, I had to quit my job. Because of your arguments, I can't keep working as a butcher, which I enjoyed. Well, I wish you happy birthday. You two changed minds. Well, thank you, I suppose. I'm sorry that you were in that situation. I think that a lot of people, a lot of vegans think that we should be unempathetic towards people who are in a situation like yours. They're like a butcher or a farmer, and someone says, listen, this is my job, this is my livelihood, like I can't just give this up. And the vegan often likes to kind of be like, boo-hoo, cry me a river, we're talking about animal torture here. And you can understand why that's the case. You can understand, like, we're talking about like one of the most egregious horrors in human history, or like ongoing throughout human history, versus like one person's job, right? But we have to remember the context of the world we live in, right? Because the vegan will like to say, we shouldn't congratulate people, sympathize with people who are struggling with the ethics of veganism, because this is animal torture, right? If somebody kind of goes vegetarian, we shouldn't congratulate them. We should say it's about time and you need to go vegan as well. But I don't think this is how it works, right? We live in a world where it is genuinely like, it's so overwhelmingly likely that your entire life has been surrounded by animal products and normalized to the extent that you don't even see it as a problem or even like an ethical question. And all of a sudden you're hit with this realization that it's potentially one of the most important ethical questions that we're currently facing. And I think there's a certain sense of like grief that comes along with that, with kind of like, not only did I not see this, but it's so overwhelming, it's so new, it's so crazy, it's so intense, that I think we need to have some kind of empathy for people in that situation, right? We can't use it to excuse continuing to contribute to unethical behavior in any sense. But we can at least be sympathetic. We can say, listen, I know this sucks. I'm glad you're doing this. I'm glad you're on board. I'm glad you understand the philosophy. But, I understand that this is actually quite a difficult thing for someone who, like yourself, and I don't quite know how to pronounce the name that you've put there, who was working as a butcher. And I wouldn't have necessarily blamed you for not being able to give up your job. Like, we recognize as vegans, it's kind of going to be a gradual change, right? We're talking about changing the way that we do food overall. It's not going to happen overnight. Like, we're not expecting butchers to just give up overnight, or for farmers to just change to plant-based agriculture overnight. Obviously, that would be fantastic if it happened, but we're not expecting that kind of thing. So it's a difficult situation you're in, but I'm glad that you kind of are so on board with this, that you're willing to make that kind of step. It's a highly virtuous thing, and it means a lot that you would say that. But I just wanted to use that as an opportunity to just say that I think vegans do need to be more empathetic. They like to compare it a lot of the time to other ethical atrocities. They say you wouldn't make these kinds of concessions on other ethical philosophies. You wouldn't be like, sympathetic to somebody who was giving up domestic abuse or something. But like, we don't live in a world where literally everybody is committing domestic abuse. If we lived in a world where that was actually the norm, and somebody decided to stand up and say, no, listen, I recognize, I think this is wrong. I think I need to stop this. Then I think that would be something that's worth congratulating. Because yeah, sure, we can recognize now that it's obviously wrong, but for somebody to take that step in that culture, I think can be a difficult thing for them to do. And I think it's worth congratulating. And I think we should have a little more empathy in that respect. But maybe I'll make a video about that in the future. Anyway, Captain Christianity, Cameron, I just caught you because I'm just about to log off. But thanks for being here, and thanks for the super chat. Capturing Christianity, Cameron Bertuzzi, of course, letting people know about the Capturing Christianity conference that is happening in Houston, Texas in August, for which I believe there are still tickets available. And you will be able to find them by going to, I imagine it's just capturingchristianity.com, but I will check that. Christianity.com. Yes, capturingchristianity.com, where you can find tickets. I'm going to be debating. You may be wondering, why am I appearing at a Christianity conference? I am going to be debating Braxton Hunter on the issue of God's existence. But there's a great lineup of other notable Christian thinkers who you'll probably have heard of. People like Lee Strobel, author of The Case for Christ. Josh Rasmussen is also going to be there, as well as let me just get up the full lineup, actually, because it's not that large. Liz Jackson, who I debated on Pascal's Wager a little while back, you may remember. Trent Horn, who I also debated recently. I thought I had a pretty good conversation with him. Luke Barnes, as well, who knows a lot about the fine-tuning argument and is a name that is always brought up in those conversations. So it'll be interesting to meet him as well. Yeah, it's gonna be fantastic. So if you guys can make it, if you're going to be in the Houston area, then make sure to get your tickets. Anyway, thank you all for being here. I appreciate all the questions, and I'm sorry I didn't manage to get to them all, especially the super chats that would have disappeared, or that I may have missed, kind of skipped through. I'm very sorry about that. As I say, if you did send a super chat, do just send me an email, because I feel bad that I missed them. But I'm not sure how quickly I'll get back to you, because after all, it is still my birthday. So I'm gonna go and do something, get a coffee, whatever you can do, given the current national circumstance. But yeah, thanks for stopping by. I thought I'd just take a moment to fill you in what's going on and why I'm not going to be very active until the summertime, which if you missed at the beginning, it's because my finals are in the summer. So after that, expect more content. But until then, I might be a little bit quiet. So this was a nice way to just sign off, at least for the time being. And yeah, cool, sweet. All right, catch you later.